Welcome back to Inside Dark History, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today I'm taking you into a story about the macabre, centuries-old curse of the Corbyns family, where every firstborn has met the exact same terrifying end, a story that you might have never heard before, a mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together we'll explore the darkest pages of history and you won't want to miss a thing. In the grand and often brutal tapestry of history, some patterns are threads of gold tracing the celebrated rise of empires, the triumphant march of progress, and the lineage of kings. They are the stories we teach, the legacies we honor. But other patterns, far more sinister, are stitches of pure, unadulterated dread. They are not woven in gold but in blood, and fear malevolent repetitions that defy logic, mock science, and whisper of rules that govern our world from dimensions we dare not acknowledge. This is the story of such a pattern, a relentless, horrifying cadence of death known as the Corbyns curse. This is not a spectre that rattles chains in the halls of a decaying manor, nor a vengeful ghost chained to a forgotten grave. It is something infinitely more terrifying. It is a calendar, a clockwork predator, utterly precise and dispassionate, that has hunted a single English bloodline for over 300 years with an accuracy that leaves no room for coincidence and freezes the very marrow in one's bones. For the Corbyns family, the greatest horror is not the unknown but the terribly, intimately known. They live not in fear of a potential tragedy, but in the certainty of a recurring one, a date circled in blood on the calendar of each generation. The pattern is as simple in its design as it is monstrous in its execution. Since the year 1678, every firstborn child of the Corbyns family, regardless of gender, location, or the precautions of their desperate parents, perishes on the night of their 7th birthday, not a day before, not a day after. The scene that greets the grieving family is always the same, a meticulously replicated tableau of inexplicable terror. The child is found lying face down upon the floor, arms outstretched, as if in a final desperate plea to an unseen force, or perhaps a posture of bizarre, ritualistic surrender. There are never any marks of violence, never any signs of a struggle or foul play that could offer the cold comfort of a rational explanation. There is only the profound silence of a stopped heart and a single shared signature across the centuries, an expression of such absolute, mind-shattering terror frozen on their innocent faces that it has been described by physicians and coroners time and again as something utterly unnatural, a physiological impossibility. One London physician in 1845 wrote, "It is as if the child's soul was shown the entirety of hell in a single instant, and the body, in an act of mercy, simply ceased to function." What force, what malevolent intelligence could possibly conduct a symphony of death with such unwavering liturgical precision? The answer, or perhaps the beginning of its long shadow, lies in the cold, damp earth of Northumberland, England. It is here that Corbyns Manor stands, or rather endure. It does not nestle into the landscape, it imposes itself upon it. It is not a place of welcoming Gothic beauty, but a stern, defiant monolith of grey Jacobean stone that seems to absorb the afternoon sunlight rather than reflect it, hoarding the light and leaving only chill behind. For generations, locals have spoken of the house in hushed tones, their glances quick and fearful, a hand instinctively making the sign of the cross as they pass its long, oppressive shadow. Local folklore insists that birdsong ceases within its walls, that the silence within its grounds is not peaceful or empty, but a heavy, watchful thing broken only by the wind that whispers through the barren branches of ancient oaks like a continuous, sorrowful lament. Its many vacant windows stare out across the bleak, wind-swept landscape like the vacant eyes of a skull, silent witnesses to a legacy of tragedy so profound it seems to have seeped into the very mortar of the building's foundations. To truly understand the genesis of this darkness, one must journey back in time to the late 17th century, an era of stark, fascinating contrasts where the bright dawn of reason championed by the newly formed Royal Society battled the deep twilight of superstition. It was an age where Isaac Newton was formulating the laws of gravity, yet men of influence still consulted alchemists and sought to commune with angels. It was a time of immense change when the sails of English merchant ships billowed with the promise of fortunes wrested from the mysterious and distant East. London, recovering from plague and fire, buzzed with new wealth, and men of ambition and little conscience could rise to the aristocracy on tides of tea, calico spice and secrets. But this age of exploration did not only bring back gold and precious goods, it brought back foreign ideas, ancient beliefs, and sometimes tangible things, artifacts and relics that should have remained buried in the lands where they were found. And on one such vessel returning to England's shores in the year 1677 was the man who would serve as the anchor for this curse, Thomas Corbyn. To the world he was the very epitome of the new English merchant, pragmatic, shrewd, a man of ledgers and contracts whose arduous travels had rewarded him with a fortune vast enough to purchase the manor and its surrounding lands, securing a place for his name among the landed gentry. He presented a respectable, unshakable facade of a man in control of his destiny. But beneath this carefully constructed veneer of respectable commerce, a secret, dangerous fire burned. Thomas possessed a deep, insatiable fascination with the occult, an obsession he had cultivated during his long voyages bartering not just for silks in Calcutta, but for forbidden knowledge in dusty back-alley markets. His private library, established in the locked east wing of the manor, quickly became a whispered legend among the few scholars of the arcane who knew of its existence. It was not a gentleman's collection of curiosities, but a dangerous archive, a potential nexus of dark power. Its shelves groaned under the weight of esoteric tomes bound in human skin astrolabes that charted unknown stars and scrolls written in languages long dead. Yet among all the scrolls and talismans, one object held a particular unspoken significance, a secret he guarded above all others. According to the fragmented, almost frantic accounts from his own journals discovered centuries later, he had acquired it from a remote, nearly inaccessible temple carved into the Himalayan foothills. It was a small figurine no larger than a man's hand, carved from a piece of black, light-absorbing stone that felt strangely cold to the touch. It depicted a seated entity with the unnerving body of a child, but the face of something ancient, weary, and predatory. He had been shown the relic by an ancient, wizened holy man who had warned him with a grave and sorrowful solemnity never to remove it from its sacred resting place. It was a ward the holy man had insisted a vessel that contained and placated a being that fed on untapped potential on the futures that were yet to be written. Thomas, a man of the new world of logic and profit, a man who had seen the brutalities of trade and the superstitions of foreign lands, dismissed these warnings as the fearful ramblings of a primitive mind. In an act of supreme colonial and personal hubris that would seal his family's fate, he secretly took the figurine, believing he was merely liberating a fascinating artifact for his private collection. He had no idea he was not stealing an object, but rather unleashing a predator and incurring a debt that would be paid again and again in the most precious currency he possessed, the blood of his firstborn, for all generations to come. For a time, it seemed Thomas Corbyn's gamble had paid off spectacularly. The years following his return to England were ones of unparalleled prosperity. His ventures flourished, his reputation as a shrewd and influential man grew, and in the spring of 1677 he took a wife, Elizabeth Hale, the gentle daughter of a neighbouring landowner. The union brought a softness to the stern halls of Corbyn Manor, a sense of domestic peace that stood in stark contrast to the dark secrets locked away in the East Wing. In the summer of 1678, on Midsummer's Eve, that peace reached its zenith with the birth of a son and heir, Jonathan. The joy that filled the manor was palpable, a bright light that for a time seemed to push back the ever-present shadows. Thomas, holding his son, perhaps allowed himself to believe that the warnings of a world away were indeed just the fading echoes of a superstitious past, irrelevant to his new life as an English lord. The black figurine remained in his library a silent, cold observer, and the debt he had incurred remained unmentioned, a sleeping beast. But the beast was not sleeping. It was waiting. As Jonathan grew from an infant into a bright, inquisitive boy, a cold, creeping dread began to take root in Thomas's heart. He watched his son, the living embodiment of his legacy, and saw not a future of promise but a ticking clock. Each passing year was a milestone, not of life, but of a rapidly approaching deadline. He became withdrawn, spending more and more time in his library, poring over the very texts he had once studied, with academic curiosity now searching them, with a desperate, frantic urgency for some form of protection, some counter-ritual that could undo what he had done. Elizabeth, his wife, saw only a husband growing distant and melancholic, attributing it to the pressures of his vast estate, never guessing at the true, horrifying nature of his anxiety. Then came the day of Jonathan's 7th birthday. The day began with forced festivity, a lavish celebration that felt hollow and brittle to Thomas. As night fell, a storm of unnatural violence descended upon the estate, lashing the windows with horizontal rain and shaking the ancient stones of the manor. It was a storm that seemed to cut them off from the rest of the world, isolating them in a bubble of impending doom. While the household huddled by their fires, historical accounts from servant testimonies recorded later in parish logs reveal the first, truly inexplicable event. 2 servants passing the boy's bedchamber reported hearing strange sounds from within. Not the cries or whimpers of a frightened child, but whispers. It was Jonathan's voice, they swore, but he was not speaking to himself. It was a conversation, a one-sided dialogue with an unseen, unheard visitor, punctuated by long listening silences. The tone, they said, was not one of fear, but of childish curiosity, as if he were being told a story or a secret by a new friend who had appeared in his room. The storm passed as abruptly as it had begun, leaving an eerie pre-dawn silence. When Jonathan's nurse entered his room at sunrise to wake him for his birthday breakfast, she was met with a scene of profound horror that would become the first entry in the family's bloody ledger. The room was unnaturally cold. The boy was not in his bed. He was on the floor, lying face down, his small arms outstretched. His body was already cold to the touch, his eyes wide open, pupils dilated in what the attending physician, a man of 40 years' practice, described in a shaken letter to a colleague as the most profound and absolute terror I have ever witnessed on a human face, child or man. It was as if his very soul had been shown a glimpse of eternity's fire and was scorched from existence. Thomas Corbyns' desperate hope had shattered. His secret, his sin, was no longer an abstract fear. It had a name, a date, and a victim. Devastated, he locked himself away in his library, not emerging for days, while his grieving wife, unable to comprehend the depth of his despair or the cause of their tragedy, began a slow descent into a sorrow so deep that she took her own life 6 months later, leaving Thomas utterly alone in the imposing manor with only his guilt and his forbidden books for company. 5 years passed, years in which Corbyn Manor became a place not of life but of grim, obsessive study. Thomas, now a hollowed-out version of his former self, driven by a desperate need to both understand and defeat the entity he had unleashed, made a calculated decision. He remarried. His new wife, a young woman named Sarah Winchester, 20 years his junior, was a means to an end, another chance at an heir, another chance to break the pattern. In 1685, their first child, another son named Richard, was born, but this time there was no joy in the Corbyn household, only a renewed sense of terror. The 7-year clock had been reset. Those 7 years were a testament to Thomas Corbyn's escalating paranoia. He transformed Corbyn Manor into a fortress against an invisible enemy. He hired armed guards to stand constant watch outside the boys' room, their muskets loaded. He summoned clergymen from York and Durham to perform prayers and blessings, their holy water seeming to steam and evaporate on the cold stone of the child's doorway. Witnesses describe Thomas himself in the weeks leading up to the fatal birthday, engaging in frantic, seemingly mad rituals around the estate, drawing complex symbols in salt-burning, strange, acrid-smelling herbs from his collection, and chanting guttural words from his ancient texts under the pale light of the moon. He was a man at war with a shadow, using every weapon, rational and irrational, at his disposal. None of it mattered. On the morning after Richard's 7th birthday, the guards were found asleep at their posts, having heard and seen nothing. The priest's blessings had failed, the salt circles were undisturbed, and inside the locked room, Richard Corbyn was found in the exact same manner as his half-brother Jonathan before him, face down, arms outstretched, his face a mask of absolute horror. The pattern was not a coincidence, it was a rule. It was a debt being collected with merciless precision. The entity could not be blocked, it could not be prayed away, and it could not be fought. Thomas Corbyn, broken and defeated, died in 1696, leaving his cursed estate to his third son William, a boy who had only survived, it was believed, because he was not a firstborn. The curse had been cemented into the Corbyn lineage, a hereditary disease of the soul that would be passed down through generations. And so it was. The pattern continued with the soulless rhythm of a funeral drum. William's firstborn daughter Mary died in 1712. His grandson's firstborn son perished in 1740. The curse followed the family through the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, a medieval horror surviving in an age of increasing reason. The Corbyns became a family defined by their tragedy, their name a whispered byword for ill fortune. And with each death, the original sin of Thomas Corbyn grew more distant, the why of their suffering lost to time, leaving only the brutal, inescapable what. That is, until the year 1856. The curse had just claimed Victoria Corbyn, the 7-year-old daughter of James Corbyn. James, a man who embodied the passionate and often violent spirit of the Victorian era, was not one for quiet suffering. Driven by a grief that had curdled into a white-hot rage, he decided that if he could not save his child, he would destroy the source of the curse. He returned to the ancestral manor in Northumberland, and in a final desperate act of defiance, he set fire to the East Wing, the very wing that housed Thomas Corbyn's infamous satanic library. He watched as flames consumed the leather-bound tomes and forbidden scrolls, a righteous inferno meant to cleanse his family's legacy. But fate, it seems, has a flair for the dramatic. As James sifted through the smouldering, ash-filled ruins of the library the next day, searching for some sense of closure, his foot struck something hard. Buried beneath a charred beam was a single, iron-bound chest, blackened and warped by the heat, but miraculously intact. Prying it open, he found it contained not a demonic artifact, but something far more chilling, the personal handwritten journal of his ancestor, Thomas Corbyn. With trembling hands, James read the spidery, fading script. The early pages spoke of ambition, of the voyage to India, of the thrill of acquiring rare and powerful objects. But then the tone shifted. Thomas wrote of the black figurine of the holy man's warning, and of the strange dreams that plagued his voyage home. Dreams of a voice that spoke to him from the idol, a voice that promised him wealth and influence in exchange for the smallest of tributes. Thomas, in his arrogance, had accepted what he thought was a symbolic bargain. The truth was unveiled in the entries written after Jonathan's death. The script became a frantic, barely legible scrawl, the ink smudged by what could only be tears of terror and regret. He described his realization that the tribute was not symbolic, that the collector, as the entity called itself, had marked his bloodline. The final pages, a confession written shortly before his own death, laid the truth bare in a torrent of horrified self-recrimination that chilled James to the bone 2 centuries later. Thomas wrote, "I have damned not only my soul, but the souls of all who shall come after me. The collector has marked us. The price for my ambition was not my wealth, but my blood, the first fruit of every generation. The debt shall be paid through generations, and I, its foolish architect, am powerless to stop it. May God have mercy, for the collector has none." The mystery of what was happening to the Corbyns had finally been answered, but in its place a new, more terrifying question had emerged. How do you fight a curse that your own ancestor had invited in? How do you escape a debt that was now part of your very name? The discovery of Thomas Corbyn's journal was a watershed moment. It transformed the family's plight from a seemingly random, malevolent haunting into a documented, inherited debt. The why had been answered in the frantic script of a 17th-century merchant. But this knowledge provided no comfort. In fact, it deepened the horror. For if the curse was not a ghost that could be exorcised but a pact that had been struck, how could it possibly be fought? The journal provided a motive, but it offered no explanation for the mechanism of the curse. How could a pact made centuries ago reach through time and stop a child's heart with such precision? As the 18th and 19th centuries gave way to the 20th, the descendants of Thomas Corbyn, now armed with this terrible knowledge, shifted their focus. Theirs was no longer a battle of faith and superstition alone, but a desperate multi-generational investigation to document, quantify, and perhaps one day scientifically prove the existence of their intangible tormentor. They began to build a case file, one filled not with folklore, but with chilling, irrefutable evidence. One of the earliest and most compelling attempts to challenge the curse with reason came in 1783. Charles Corbyn, a man of the Enlightenment who placed his faith in logic and empirical observation, approached his son Edward's 7th birthday with methodical determination. He refused to be cowed by what he considered ancestral superstition. He invited two renowned physicians, one from London and another from Edinburgh, to observe the boy through the night, determined to either debunk the curse or document its nature. The boy's room was brightly lit with dozens of candles. 4 men of science, including Charles himself, kept a constant vigilant watch at the child's bedside, armed with notebooks and a healthy dose of skepticism. As midnight approached, however, their scientific detachment began to crumble. The physicians noted a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature, their breath misting in the air despite the many flames. The candles, one by one, began to dim and flicker, as if starved of oxygen, though no detectable draught could be found. At that point, Edward, who had been sleeping peacefully, began to whisper in his sleep. The words were unintelligible, but one of the physicians, Dr. Alastair Finch, described them in a later letter as ancient and guttural in nature, a language that seemed to vibrate in the very bones, utterly alien to any child's throat. Then, at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, every single candle in the room was extinguished, simultaneously plunging them into absolute darkness and confusion. In the frantic scramble to relight a lantern, a period of no more than 20 seconds, Edward somehow moved from his bed to the center of the floor. By the time light was restored, the boy lay in the now familiar horrific position, face down, arms outstretched, his young face frozen in that signature mask of terror. None of the observers, men of unimpeachable scientific integrity, could explain how it happened or what force could have stopped a child's heart without leaving a single mark on his body. Their signed and notarized testimonies detailing the impossible events of that night became the first formal piece of evidence that whatever plagued the Corbyn family defied rational explanation. This pattern of attempting to cage the phenomenon in science only to have science fail repeated itself with even more precision in the modern era. In 1913, Dr. Peter Corbyn, a respected surgeon in Edinburgh, decided to leverage the full power of modern medicine. He arranged for his daughter Catherine to spend the night of her 7th birthday under observation in a hospital connected to the most advanced monitoring equipment of the time, capable of recording her heart rate, breathing, and brain activity. A team of nurses and fellow physicians kept constant watch. The medical records from that night are a chilling testament to a battle between technology and the unknown. At 2:45 a.m., Catherine's heart rate displayed on the cardioscope suddenly accelerated to a frantic pace, though she showed no external signs of distress. At 2:57 a.m., the temperature in the sealed, climate-controlled room dropped so dramatically that ice crystals formed on the water glass beside her bed. And at exactly 3:00 a.m., every piece of electrical equipment in the room failed simultaneously. When emergency gas lights were activated just moments later, Catherine was on the floor beside her hospital bed, lifeless, in the classic Corbyn posture. The monitoring equipment, once power was restored, showed a flat line. Her heart had simply ceased to function. Dr. Corbyns' detailed report, published pseudonymously in a medical journal, described it as a death by induced terror, a fear so profound it acted as a neurological switch turning off the heart. He had documented the what with clinical precision, but the how and the why remained terrifyingly out of reach. The most recent, and perhaps most disturbing piece of irrefutable evidence came in 2017. The parents of 7-year-old Jack Corbyn, both medical professionals themselves, installed a sophisticated monitoring system in his room, including high-definition infrared cameras and sensitive temperature sensors. The footage from that night is the stuff of nightmares precisely because of its clarity. It shows the room growing progressively colder, the temperature dropping a degree every few minutes after midnight. At approximately 2:45 a.m., a shadow appears in the corner of the room on the infrared feed. It is not a shadow cast by any object. It is a darker patch of cold that seems to move with its own volition, independent of any light source. At 2:58 a.m., Jack, who had been sleeping peacefully, suddenly sits upright in bed, his eyes wide open, but clearly unseeing. His lips begin to move, though the highly sensitive audio equipment captures no sound. Then at exactly 3:00 a.m., the cameras experience a burst of static and interference for precisely 15 seconds. When the image clears, Jack is no longer in his bed. He is on the floor in the position that has defined his family's curse for centuries, already lifeless. This footage, analyzed by experts in video technology, physics, and paranormal research, offers no definitive explanation. It offers only proof. Proof of a cold, silent, shadowy presence. Proof of a force that can enter a child's room and in 15 seconds of unrecordable horror, extinguish a life. The accumulation of such impossible yet documented evidence shifted the family's quest once more. If the entity could not be stopped, perhaps at last, it could be understood at its source. This led to the lifelong crusade of one of the family's most remarkable figures, Clara Corbyn. Having lost her own son Andrew to the curse in 1965, Clara dedicated her entire life not to escaping the family's fate, but to retracing its origins. In the 1970s, armed with a copy of Thomas Corbyns' journal and a relentless determination, she traveled to India, beginning a years-long search for the temple he had desecrated. After countless dead ends, she claimed to have found it, or rather its ruins, in a remote, almost inaccessible area of the Himalayan foothills. What she discovered there provided the final horrifying layer of understanding to the family's curse. Through conversations with local elders and her study of the crumbling ruins, Clara unveiled the full, terrible nature of the entity. The temple, she learned, had been dedicated to a being the ancient texts called the Collector of Potential, an entity that existed in a state of perpetual hunger, not for souls or life force in the traditional sense, but for possibilities. It fed on the infinite unwritten futures contained within a developing human consciousness. According to the philosophy of the long-dead priests who had guarded the site, a child of 7 represented the perfect terrible balance. They were old enough to have formed a distinct personality, a unique consciousness, but young enough that their future remained an almost limitless expanse of untapped potential. To the collector, this was the most potent form of nourishment. The black figurine Thomas had stolen was not just a representation of this entity, it was a vessel and anchor designed to contain a portion of its essence. By removing it from the temple, Thomas had broken ancient wards of containment, inadvertently granting the entity a direct conduit to our world with his own bloodline as the permanent tragic entry point. The most disturbing part of Clara's confession to the family council upon her return was what she found in the temple's inner sanctum. There she discovered a series of wall carvings eroded by time but still terrifyingly clear that depicted the entity's feeding process. The carvings showed children, all of them lying face down with their arms outstretched, the exact nightmarish position in which every single Corbyn firstborn had been found for 300 years. Thomas's journal was not the ravings of a guilty man, it was a witness statement. The curse was real, its rules were ancient, and its appetite was unending. This complete, soul-crushing understanding of their fate led to a new era for the family, an era of desperate, heartbreaking consequences and futile attempts at escape. The knowledge did not bring freedom, it brought a more refined form of despair. Socially, the Corbyns had long been pariahs. Despite their wealth, their name was a stain, their bloodline a guarantee of tragedy. Other prominent families avoided them as one would a plague carrier, and the Corbyns found themselves increasingly isolated, a notorious clan of the damned, unable to form alliances or even friendships without their dark history looming over the relationship. This isolation, coupled with the certainty of the curse, led to a series of tragic, calculated decisions. Some branches of the family, faced with the certainty of what awaited a firstborn child, simply chose to die out, refusing to have children at all. Others tried to cheat the curse through geography and identity. Richard Thorne, born Richard Corbyn in the early 20th century, legally changed his name upon turning 18, foolishly believing that shedding the Corbyn name would sever the entity's claim. He lost his firstborn son on his 7th birthday in 1932. Another branch of the family, convinced the curse was tied to the English soil, fled the country, entirely moving to Boston in the late 19th century. The curse, unbound by distance, crossed the Atlantic with them, claiming its victim in their Beacon Hill home with the same merciless ease it had shown in Northumberland. But perhaps the most tragic and telling case of all was that of Michael and Sarah Corbyn in 1983. In an ultimate act of desperate love, they concocted a plan to save their firstborn son. Immediately after his birth, they gave him up for a closed adoption, arranging for him to be placed with a family in Auckland, New Zealand, who were never told of his biological heritage. They legally changed their own last names and moved to Canada, severing all ties. They believed that if the child never knew he was a Corbyn, if he grew up on the opposite side of the world, loved and protected by a different family, he might somehow be spared. Their efforts were in vain. On July 12, 1990, a 7-year-old boy named David Marshall died in his sleep in Auckland. The local authorities, finding no cause, ruled it a tragic case of sudden, unexplained death in childhood. But a private investigator hired by the grieving Corbyns confirmed the horrifying details. The boy had been found by his adoptive parents on the floor, face down, arms outstretched, his face frozen in a mask of unspeakable terror. This case raised the most disturbing questions of all. How did the curse track down a child who had no knowledge of his heritage? The answer was as simple as it was devastating. The curse was not tied to a name, a place, or even an awareness of its existence. It was tied irrevocably to the blood. It was a debt that could never be outrun. The horrifying case of the adopted child, David Marshall, marked a turning point for the surviving members of the Corbyn family. It was the final brutal confirmation that their enemy could not be outrun, outwitted, or abandoned. The curse was not a geographical anomaly tied to the English manor, nor was it a psychological burden passed down through whispered tales. It was a biological fact, a predatory lien placed upon their very blood. This realization, born from centuries of pain, led to the collapse of all prior strategies. Hope for a simple escape was extinguished, and in its place a new, grimly unified resolve began to form. If they could not flee their destiny, they would stand and face it, armed not with hope, but with data. In the winter of 1998, a most unusual gathering took place at the largely abandoned Corbyn Manor. Representatives from every surviving branch of the family, from Boston, from Toronto, from the quiet shires of England, convened for what they called the Family Council. They met under the oppressive roof where the curse began, not as a family sharing grief, but as a multi-generational research team pooling its resources. For the first time, 3 centuries of fragmented history, personal journals, newspaper clippings, coroner's reports, and oral histories were brought together in one place. They were no longer isolated victims, they were the world's foremost experts on their own damnation, and they were determined to redefine their fight. From this council, two groundbreaking discoveries emerged redefining the known parameters of the curse. The first came from Dr. Elizabeth Corbyn, a geneticist who had devoted her career to studying the family's DNA. She presented her findings a distinctive, highly complex and unidentifiable genetic sequence present in every single Corbyn descendant she had tested. It was a marker unique to their bloodline. When she ran this sequence through international genetic databases, she found no direct matches. However, she did find shocking partial matches in DNA samples recovered from ancient burial sites in the mountainous regions of northern India, precisely the area where Thomas Corbyn had acquired the mysterious black figurine. For the first time, there was a physical biological anchor for the curse, a tangible signature woven into their cells. The second discovery came from Richard Thorne, the historian who had once changed his name to escape the family's fate. Having dedicated his life to cross-referencing every known death with historical records, he had identified a pattern no one had noticed before. The deaths almost always occurred on the night of the 7th birthday, but only when that date fell within 3 days of a new moon. In the rare cases where the birthday occurred during other lunar phases, the death would invariably come on the night closest to the birthday that coincided with the new moon. Suddenly, the curse had an astronomical component, an eerie connection to cosmic cycles. The enemy was no longer just a malevolent entity, it was a phenomenon with a genetic marker and an astronomical trigger, a predator that hunted by the light of a dark moon. Armed with this new, terrifying understanding, the family council concluded with a desperate ritual designed by the aged Clara Corbyn, incorporating protective elements from multiple spiritual traditions and timed to culminate at the exact moment of the new moon. For a brief, tantalizing period, it seemed to have worked. 2 Corbyn firstborns passed their 7th birthdays without incident in 1999 and 2000, and a fragile hope began to bloom in the family for the first time in centuries, but it was a false dawn. In 2003, the curse returned with the death of 7-year-old Emily Corbyn in Toronto. She died in the familiar, horrifying manner despite her parents' meticulous adherence to every protective measure established at the council. The family's combined knowledge, their rituals, their science, it had all failed. The entity had merely been waiting. This failure led to the most audacious and chilling experiment in the family's history, centered around twins Lily and Michael, born in 2015. The family theorized that the entity's focus on firstborn potential might be confused or diluted in the case of twins. To test this, they enacted a meticulous deception. Though Lily had been born 8 minutes before her brother, her parents created false birth certificates showing their son Michael as the firstborn. This lie was maintained with absolute secrecy. Everyone, family members, teachers, even their pediatrician, was told that Michael was the elder sibling. The twins themselves grew up believing it. It was a direct, calculated attempt to fool the entity itself. On the night of their 7th birthday in 2022, both children were put to bed in separate, monitored rooms. As the night deepened, the monitoring teams communicating via radio confirmed identical, horrifying patterns. At 2:45 a.m., the temperature in both rooms began to drop simultaneously. At 2:58 a.m., both children sat up in their beds, eyes open but unseeing, and appeared to engage in one-sided silent conversations. At precisely 3:00 a.m., power fluctuations affected both monitoring systems for 12 seconds. When the emergency backups activated, a horrifying discovery awaited. In his room, Michael remained asleep, unharmed. But in her room, Lily, the true firstborn, lay face down on the floor in the traditional terrible position. The entity could not be fooled by human deception. It knew, it had always known, it operated on a level of fundamental truth beyond birth certificates and human lies. The curse was absolute, and through all this, one question, one lingering secret remained. The black figurine, the dark heart of this entire tragedy, has never been found. Some believe it was consumed in the 1856 fire. Others fear it still lies hidden somewhere within the decaying walls of Corbyn Manor, a silent, patient epicenter of a centuries-long storm. Which brings us to the present day and the chilling intersection of ancient curse and cutting-edge science. In 2023, Dr. Meredith Kline, a quantum physicist, intrigued by the extensive documentation, proposed a new theory. She suggested that the Corbyn curse is not supernatural in the traditional sense, but a manifestation of what she terms quantum predation. Her theory posits that the entity is a consciousness that exists primarily in quantum states, and it feeds quite literally on the collapse of quantum potentialities. A 7-year-old child, Dr. Kline theorizes, represents a nexus point of nearly infinite potential futures. The entity feeds on the moment of collapse when all those possible lives are extinguished, reduced to the single outcome of death. The signature posture, she suggests, represents a state of quantum surrender, when all possibilities have been consumed. An experiment was proposed to create a quantum shield around the next Corbyn child, an attempt to isolate them from the quantum field the entity might use to access our reality. That child was to be William Corbyn, living in Toronto. His 7th birthday was on October 31, 2024, a date that coincided ominously with both Halloween and a new moon. But the entity, it seems, is evolving. On February 3, 2024, 8 months before the experiment could take place, William Corbyn died. February 3rd was the new moon closest to the 7th anniversary of a severe bout of pneumonia William had suffered as an infant, an illness that had left him clinically dead for 3 minutes before he was revived. The entity, becoming more aggressive, or perhaps more hungry, had adapted its pattern. It had claimed its tribute based on a prior claim on the boy's life. William was found, as all the others before him, face down, arms outstretched, his future consumed. The unbroken evolving pattern of the Corbyn curse forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, to look past the firelight of our understanding into the vast darkness beyond. It raises the most fundamental questions about our existence. If a bloodline can be marked so thoroughly that no action, no distance, no deception, and no science can break its hold, are we truly as free as we believe? Or are there patterns, debts, and destinies woven into the fabric of reality, into our very DNA, that bind certain lineages to inescapable fates? For the Corbyns, this is not a philosophical debate. It is a deadly practical reality played out in the stolen lives of their children. Their story is a harrowing, 350-year-long testament to a battle against an enemy they cannot see, but whose presence is felt in the cold dread of every generation. It is a warning written in tears and funeral rites. A warning that there are forces in this world that operate by rules we do not and perhaps cannot understand. A warning that some debts once incurred are passed down through time like a shadow in the blood, a shadow that can never be outrun. The entity Thomas Corbyn encountered in that ancient temple continues its grim harvest, and until someone finds a way to break the pattern, it will continue its collection, generation after generation, with the merciless precision that has made the Corbyn curse one of history's most enduring and terrifying mysteries.